uh, um, unmute yourselves or put it in the chat if anything's really unclear, or you have something that you'd like to talk about right away. There'll also be periodic times to get involved and interact. Hopefully there'll be time for a writing exercise at the end. So right now, I thought it would just be fun and useful to put in the chat one word about how you're doing, what you want to get out of the workshop, and then your experience with trauma-informed care. The 2 and 3 can be more than one word. They can be like a sentence or so. Just like to see that real quick. Curious, nice. Don't overthink it. Just throw a few things out there. Okay, yeah, that some of us are tired. Okay, happy it's summer, nice. Excited, great. Yeah, it's really overlooked. Yeah, thank you. Great. Feel free to keep those coming and I'll move on as well in the interest of time. So as mentioned, this is a crash course. There's more available. Please do get in touch if you'd like to do the longer version. It's especially for those of you who are professionals working with trauma victims. I'll explain why I use the word victim rather than survivor. And just as a disclaimer, like you may not agree with these, and the ideas here may challenge things that you've previously learned or been working with, and frameworks you've been working with. It's fine to disagree, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and discuss that at some point with any of you. But please do just keep an open mind. So we use the words victims, crimes, and perpetrators to call attention to the severity of what induces trauma, because usually there is a crime committed. So instead of things like child abuse, we would use the word crime. We'd use the words like perpetrators and victims instead of parents and survivors and so on. So it's more of in the juridical sense to emphasize that crimes are committed. So I'm going to be filling in a lot of gaps in conventional trauma-informed care. I'd like to say that I do value trauma-informed care. I just think that there's some gaps. There's some pieces of the puzzle missing. I've been fortunate to work with psychiatrist Dr. Muriel Salmona for decades and translate her books, which have been influential in France. So I'm drawing from her theories and her research. Okay. So justice informed, that's my term for filling in the pieces that Salmona's research gives us. And I'll give you just a couple of those right now. So contextualizing crimes, as I mentioned, being interested in the psychology of the perpetrator, which follows a pattern that we'll look at pretty standardly. Radical empathy, emerging from behind the stage, stepping down from the stage as a caregiver, breaking down that boundary between the victim or client or patient and the care provider. So it's a humanizing approach. The goal is, of course, better care and prevention of trauma so it doesn't happen in the first place, and then better care for people and justice as well. So this can influence a lot of fields. Some of you are in education, healthcare, maybe in law, social work. These are all fields where this is very important to understand. The idea is that social justice and healing go together. So first step in healing is to recognize that a crime was committed. So instead of words like mistreatment, we would use the word crime. Okay. So again, in the chat, I would love to hear your thoughts on traumatic memory. Have you heard this term? If so, what did it refer to? If not, what do you think it might refer to? So just real quick, throw that in the chat, your first thoughts that might come to mind about that. I not heard the term. That's good to know. Other people, have you heard it? Response to child abuse. Okay, these are all really helpful. Feel free to keep them coming. Okay, great. It's good to know a little bit where you're at. Okay. So we often talk about PTSD. Everyone's heard that. Thankfully, it's crept into normal everyday language. So there is some awareness of it. It started out with veterans, extended to domestic violence, and now is a recognized disability. So that's great progress. Traumatic memory is one of the cornerstones of what Dr. Salmana's work on trauma is about. So traumatic memory is a subset of PTSD and largely neglected but crucial to understanding behavior in victims and how to better treat them and have strategies for preventing trauma from happening in the first place, to prevent crimes, in other words. Normal responses to abnormal situations. So just think about that for a second. Normal responses to abnormal situations. I think that that's really important to keep in mind, because it helps us to not individualize the problem. A lot of what we're doing today is contextualizing. So instead of certain behaviors being a problem specific to a victim, they're situated as social problems. This ties in with I've researched sociology a lot. It's one of my fields. So I'll be tying that in. And it's part of Salmana's work as well to connect the dots between, social narratives, myths, norms, and how they affect how we view trauma. And even like in your care, when you have a client and you're talking to them about their parents or about their families, those words have certain connotations that tie in with social myths that parents always want what's best for their children, or even if your family's not perfect, it's better to be in touch with them than to have no family. And so Salmana would recommend changing those words because of the connotation, not using words like mother and father. This is important, and I feel a great responsibility in talking about this. And this comes from decades of conversations with professionals dealing with trauma victims, and they're not knowing this information and wanting to know it. So, and it disturbs all of us when we don't take a justice-informed approach because of the loss of productivity, the suffering, and just the expense to society. So I think that this will be review for a lot of you, but there's some parts where I also add things to the story of what happens in the brain, which I bet most of you know. So I'll be adding some details here. So the amygdala, the fight, flight, or fight, that's hard to say, reflex. So evolutionary mechanism designed to act quickly to get us out of danger. So it doesn't have to understand what the danger is. It's just an alarm that's ringing, and the adrenaline and cortisol start running through our body so we can get away or do exactly what we need to do very quickly to escape a danger to survive. So normally after the danger is past, we can translate it into a narrative. So evolutionarily, okay, there was a saber-toothed tiger attacking me. It didn't get me. Next time I got to be more careful and tell others to be careful. But I know what happened. It made sense. The animal was hungry. It wanted to eat me. End of story. That does not create a traumatic memory. But when the event is incomprehensible, it can't be translated into the narrative or the hippocampus. There's a cutting off between the amygdala and the hippocampus. So that you can't just say, oh, this happened. Now I can move on. It was scary when it happened, but now it's over. There's no over. So it's still scary. It can't be stored as a memory, and therefore the alarm can't shut off. So the amygdala, the alarm, keeps ringing. So knowing this and knowing it in that framework, we can help people recover through narrative reconstruction is the other big term that Salmona uses a lot. So it's piecing together exactly what happened. And then having greater acceptance and empathy, recognizing people's behaviors and where those behaviors are coming from, and that they are, again, normal responses to abnormal situations. We're not evolutionarily wired to understand things like rape or sexual abuse of children. And again, that's a debatable point. But Salmon is very adamant on that point, and she draws from studies done on newborns about empathy, using their facial expressions, and argues that empathy is a natural human response, and that these things are abnormal in terms of human evolution, and that they have a cyclical pattern of trauma, which that's pretty well known, these cyclical patterns, but she goes into why. So how do we use these neurobiological findings? Many of them are buried in scientific papers that no one reads. How do we connect the dots to behaviors? So Salmona uses a lot of images, and one is of electrical appliances. I know when I make coffee every morning and the coffee grinder will shut off in the middle of grinding the coffee beans. So the electrical current shuts off in order so the device doesn't blow up. So it's like an electrical short circuit when the parts of our brain shut down so that we can survive, because in an extreme trauma, we have adrenaline, cortisol pumping through us, we might have a heart attack. So that needs to shut down. So that shuts down. And then we have these calming washes of ketamine, morphine-like substances. So that keeps us alive. What's the downside of that? Addiction. We are addicted to those chemicals. So we often talk about cycles of trauma and trauma repeating themselves, and girls abused in childhood go into prostitution, or people recite the repeat cycles of beating their kids. But so that's understood, but it's usually not connected to the neurology of what happens. So there's this dependence on the chemical substances, the adrenaline, the cortisol, which would explain why victims often go into high-risk activities, whether that's drug addiction or high-risk sports, gambling, promiscuity, prostitution, risk situations. that will procure those chemical fixes and then gain the release that comes after. So looking for situations that resemble the original trauma. And again, we're not saying that that this is a problem with the victim. It's it's again a normal response to abnormal situations. And there is a solution. There are solutions for this. So I talked about that in the hippocampus, responsible for narrative, doesn't take over from the amygdala and can't shut it down. So the memory is trapped in a place of raw emotion. So this is, again, I'm explaining what traumatic memory is. Traumatic memory is that memory trapped in a place of raw emotion. The alarm keeps ringing. The survivor's in a constant state of anxiety. Sometimes that alarm may ring fainter than others. Sometimes normal life might come back and things are going pretty well. And that can be extremely dangerous to the victim. And then there will be this neurological imperative to repeat the trauma. And then sometimes there's a trigger that can get the alarm ringing stronger. And then often there's this neurological imperative to seek danger in order to trigger the alarm ringing, in order to get the chemical fixes that are associated with it, which are an addiction. Traumatic amnesia is the norm. The more severe the trauma, the more likely it'll be partially recalled, incorrectly recalled, imprecise, garbled, or not recalled at all. So Salmana often talks about, and you might have had a similar experience, someone who comes to see you and is like, oh, my childhood was great, nothing bad happened at all. And then you start scratching the surface, or someone might come with just like relatively mild recollections of abuse. And there might be much more severe recollections of abuse on a deeper level that they'll get to. But the first ones remembered are usually the less severe ones, because of the traumatic amnesia being the norm. The younger the victim, the more likely traumatic amnesia, the closer the relation. So it's very common that it's a family member that is abusing a child, and that will have more likelihood of traumatic amnesia. That's largely because of the Stockholm syndrome. To survive, the child needs to think that the caregivers are decent people and out for their well-being. So it's more convenient to that and more effective for survival to forget what happened. And that's very tragic. And there's also society's myths again of, your parents always want what's best. They're doing the best they can. So that kind of enforces that traumatic amnesia. The memories return as emotions, nightmares, triggers of a certain smell, a certain time of day, a certain fabric, weather pattern that recalls the trauma. And the therapist's goal, the caregiver's goal, is to do this detective work together with the person to piece together exactly what happened from the first original trauma, to figure out the whole narrative, to piece it together again like a little intricate puzzle, to get that whole picture so that it can actually be translated into the hippocampus. And they've done neurological studies showing that these brain parts actually can reconnect once the narrative can be cogently told. And then it no longer colonizes the victim. This is something that happened to me, but it's not who I am. So this is very different from what I've discovered in trauma-informed care through the people I've talked to and what I've read. what I found the main difference is narrative reconstruction, what I just talked about, tracing every clue back to the original trauma, further understanding of the whole picture, translated into a narrative. So yes, that's tragic what happened, but that's something that was done to me, and these are the consequences of it. But it's not who I am. Recognition of harm, a crime was committed. You were a victim of a crime. There were laws against what happened, and they were supposed to be enforced, and they were not enforced. Society was supposed to protect you and failed to do so. And then the psychology of the perpetrator. So that's often neglected. Trauma-informed care is about the person in front of you, the patient, the client, because there's this idea, well, we can't change the perpetrator, and that would be ridiculous. We all agree on that part. But in order to understand the whole picture, we need to understand why this crime was committed. And for that, the knowledge of traumatic memory comes into play again, because that's what's at play with the perpetrator. So knowing these neurological mechanisms helps us understand exactly what's going on. So the victim is neurologically compelled to relive the trauma to get the chemical fix. The perpetrator was also a victim. So it's the same mind, and also needs to get the chemical fix by reliving the trauma. However, the difference is they can choose to use someone else to relive the trauma. So they stay out of harm's way and inflict harm on someone else instead. So they're protected, and the other person suffers. This is a minority of victims, a small minority of victims who choose this path, but it's enough to keep the cycle going. All right, your turn. I want to hear some feedback from people. Why do you think any of these matter? So feel free to unmute or put that in the chat. Just again, kind of off the top of your head, why do you think narrative reconstruction, recognition of crime, or psychology of the perpetrator matter?
I'll jump in. I would say that the narrative reconstruction matters because we need the hippocampus to be able to um, absorb it or have a place to put it, and tracing everything back and getting the full story. And then I just 2 and 3 seem to be critical to because the victim absorbs the shame, the responsibility piece, you know, and that I find that that's a really difficult obstacle that they're burdened with because of the lack of 2 and 3, kind of culturally.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. Definitely, that shame piece is really important, and understanding what really happened and why can help with that. I'm looking at the chat, but feel free to jump in, anyone. Yeah, guilt and shame again. Good. Cognitive reframing. Pain and guilt. Yeah, create space. Right. Becomes traumatic because it doesn't make sense. Integration. Yeah. Wonderful opportunity for embodiment. Yeah, we'll talk about that too. Great. Thank you for sharing those. And again, feel free to use the chat anytime with questions or comments as we go. All right. Perpetrator psychology. So we'll talk a little bit about why it matters from Dr. Salmana's perspective and from mine, and feel free to add things again in the chat. These are just some of the reasons it matters. So I'm thinking of an example of someone I know who was abused by her mother's partner as a kid. And the therapist told her that the partner that the mother chose the partner over her children. And oh, yeah, she just chose the partner over you and sacrificed you. So that's not really what's going on here. And I think that that's a very confusing, inaccurate thing because the victim, the person I know, um, would feel the inaccuracy of that because of the mother's behavior towards her, but not know what's really going on and live with that unknowing. And in this case, the person I'm talking about went through this downward spiral that she's still in and has been in her whole life of alcoholism, losing her job, losing her house. And I think if she understood the whole picture and her own symptoms and responses to what happened, then she would be able to translate this into a narrative and move on. But because there's so much confusion and misinformation, she can't do that. So, like I said, the actual thing that's going on is that the mother is using the daughter, to treat the mother's trauma. So the mother was traumatized, the mother's the victim. The mother has this neurological imperative to relive the trauma. She's made this awful choice to use her daughter. And a lot of people do that because it's very convenient to use a child. It's very easy to get away with it as a medicine, as a slave, as a treatment for the trauma, inflict it on them and get the same chemical fix. So this is a very standard pattern. There's not a lot of variety. There's not a lot of variety in motives for doing this. So the roles change, but the script doesn't change. So typically the mother was abused in that way and inflicts the same or similar abuse. And now she's in the role of the quote powerful one. She's out of harm's way. There's also a gender dimension, which is very interesting here because often men are encouraged to treat their trauma by using someone else, and women are sociologically encouraged or pushed to become victims again. And this is by no means natural. It's just how society handles that. Okay. So, like I said, perpetrator brains are also victim brains. People are born with empathy. There's this addiction imperative to relive trauma. You can inflict it on someone else and get the same benefit. But most victims are known for being extremely ethical. Like they see the downside to certain behaviors and they're not going to do that. They would rather put it upon themselves. And then they come out looking like the losers in society because of making these ethical choices. Like they become addicts, homeless, in prostitution. And actually, in a way, they're very brave and very ethical. And some of them might do both. They might be victims and perpetrators and continue being victims, but a lot of them are really ethical. And on the flip side, a lot of perpetrators, they come across as these upstanding model citizens. And the more they come across that way, the less likely they are to be challenged and caught, and the more severe their crimes can become. And that's really important to recognize when we're trying to protect vulnerable people and look at accurate signs and readings of trauma in order to find out who the real bad guys are. So children, again, a low risk way to inflict trauma and obtain a chemical fix. They've done studies across income brackets, races, professions, and so on, they found like there's more narcissists in certain professions like CEOs and fewer in professions like teaching. But overall, in terms of socioeconomic classes, there's not a difference. So that's kind of interesting because usually low income families and people are more likely to be investigated than upper class people when really there's as much chance of, for example, child abuse and people who have no conscience whatsoever, who are abiding by the law of might makes right. So this makes it difficult to protect children because of these high profile narcissists that are difficult to catch, because that's a big part of the game, is not getting caught. But if we can accurately read signs of trauma, including in children, then that would help a lot. And to do that, we also need to stop misdiagnosing children and people with signs of trauma. So like a detective team, the victim and their therapist or caregiver, their psychologist, psychiatrist, trace back every clue that they have, given that amnesia is the norm. So fragments of memory, nightmares, triggers, phobias, sensations, all of this can open up other little pieces of information in order to reconstitute a cogent narrative. So I like Salmana's work because she uses a lot of images. I'm just looking at the chat at the same time, and I like the comments here. This is a great way for us to exchange while I'm throwing all this information. I would normally have more time for interaction, but I just want to get all the information out there too. So please keep those chat comments coming. So frequent mixed diagnosis of traumatic memory with all kinds of conditions that Salmana in her clinical practice, where she's had literally over 1,000 patients over decades, she's cured people who are diagnosed with all of these and more. So that's really interesting to think about. So she's fully cured people diagnosed, for example, with schizophrenia through narrative reconstruction. They don't have to take any more drugs and they're fully cured and living productive lives. And I think that's pretty amazing. So one of her images is look for the knife. Like someone goes into the ER, they've got this big gash. There's gonna be some concern about how did that happen? And where's the weapon? What was that done with? Who did it? But when someone presents clear evidence of trauma, of traumatic memory, this is individualized and isolated from context, and we might just say it's just their brain chemistry. And it might well be their brain chemistry, but we've seen how the brain itself is modified by traumatic experience. So it's not an either or, and either, so whatever the cause, narrative reconstruction can help. Another image, this is kind of tragic. Victims being blamed and expected to keep to the same standards as non-victims, and really they're in parallel universes. So they're expected to get on with life. It's like everyone's hiking up a trail and the victims have this backpacks full of heavy rocks. And they're expected to keep up with everyone hiking up the mountain. Most of the packs are light, there's granola bar. And then the victim's blamed for not keeping up. Hey, why can't you keep up with everyone else? You know, what are you doing? And then they get to the top, the victim's utterly exhausted if she gets there at all. And the others can just kind of chat and look around, enjoy the scenery, and she's just exhausted. And no one sees or cares that she has these rocks in her back. And this ties in with the theme of resiliency, which Salma and I both dislike, because the rhetoric of resiliency often it underplays what the victim has to do in this superhuman force, that kind of glorifies having to use a superhuman force that no one should ever have to deploy, and often at great expense to themselves. And it's kind of excuses the problem in a way. The other image is of a car crash. So people who are in an accident and they are bleeding by the side of the road, and there's going to be people come and help them and get them operations and care and stop the bleeding. But with psychological trauma, it's kind of like if you got run over and you're expected to pick yourself up off the side of the road, somehow make your way home, get yourself stitched up, or you're given a Band-Aid and sent home. Maybe you get run over every day. Maybe there's some well-intentioned professionals, but if they're not understanding the neurological mechanisms of trauma, then there's a limit to what they can do to help you. If you even do find well-intentioned trauma-informed people, or can afford them. Bridging neurology and narrative reconstruction. So here's the hopeful part of what we can do about all of this mess and public health crisis of unrecognized traumatic memory. How do we get over amnesia? Relink the severed connections. As I said, there's studies that show that we can reconnect these parts of the brain. A full narrative can be pieced together. In Salmana's practice, she uses a kind of talk therapy that's really about getting rid of the minds. Like she describes survivors' lives as a minefield. They have to tiptoe around these minds. And for that, there's a series of avoidance behaviors, compulsive behaviors, and so on that gets them through this minefield for their survival and to do their best to try to do something in life. But you can look at these minds together. Okay, what is this mind? What will happen if you go there? What's that tie back into? Piece together the narrative, understand why certain things are triggered, and then lay them to rest so they're no longer taking over your life. Colonized is an interesting image for that. People are colonized by the trauma, by the horror, by the raw emotion of this amygdala alarm that keeps ringing. The writing process, I've done workshops on that, writing to get us in touch with our subconscious, and start with what is known and trace back the symptoms. So like to pause there and feel free to unmute or put in the chat what is new so far, any surprises, what's the most important thing that you have encountered so far in this workshop. I see in the chat there's a question about my book. So the book that I translated by Dr. Muriel Salmana is out. It came out in November of last year. So it's called Sexual Violence, Dissociation, and something. Okay. I think I have the title in here somewhere. But yeah, if you look up Muriel Salmana, it's published with Routledge. So so please do get that book. It's finally translated. It's in a very important, influential book in France. She just published another one specifically on the psychology of the perpetrator, and I'm going to try to translate that. I'm trying to look at funding to get that translated and also publishers to get that translated. So if you have any leads for that, let me know. Refreshing to, okay. Salmana's work, yes, thank you. Good. I'm glad that none of it is new, because a lot of people I talk to, it is new, even though they're constantly dealing with victims. So that's actually good. Oh yeah, EMDR. Salmona is very much in favor of it as kind of a short-term solution or solution that might work for some people in complement to the narrative reconstruction. Yeah, she definitely thinks it's a good thing. I also think it's positive, but not only, not on its own. How to reconnect the severed pieces. Yeah, that's very interesting. Right. So I'm not a neurologist, but the way I understand it, is that the amygdala is severed from the hippocampus, and they actually they actually reconnect, like the synapses reconnect, and they can communicate once the person can translate into narrative. Once they can sit there and tell you, this is what happened to me, and they actually reconnect. I don't know the fine points of the neurology, but there are some studies about that. If anyone has more information, feel free to jump in.
Hello.
Hi.
I'd just like to respond here. I've worked with the Victim Witness Program here in Flagstaff for the last year and 3/4, and it may be like a different environment that may be the norm. Usually I see clients maybe 1 to 3 sessions, if even that at times, and most of the people, I'd say 90%, the traumas have been ongoing almost their whole lives or whatever. So to get into the analysis of all of that, and my fearless leaders I've been following for the last 15 years, and I've got to meet these people all in person, have been, Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine, Stephen Porges, just got to meet and talk with him 2 years ago. He came to Arizona. So I follow, pretty much a bottom-up kind of approach, and a lot of psychoeducational stuff and building resilience. And I can study EMDR and tapping and hypnosis and visualizations and NLP. I have a whole slew of things I do, but I probably don't get into the reliving part, just because I only have a very short time period to have the biggest impact I can do. So just wanted to share where I'm at.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great, implies a great question. Like, what do? We don't have the time or resources to painstakingly reconstitute everything with people. And I think just giving some keys of awareness, like these ones from Salmona's book about what happened to you based on the perpetrator's psychology, and that you can do this narrative reconstruction, you can trace the symptoms back, that you're having these symptoms because there's probably something bigger that happened, and then maybe they can run with it. But I think a lot of it is having keys to understanding and keys to self understanding, and being sure not to blame themselves, which I'm sure that you're good at doing. But yeah, giving a few keys that maybe they can run with. Like Salmona has these brochures that she puts places that just have a few of the key points. And I've heard people say that even reading that and having that self-knowledge that they didn't have was really helpful. So kind of opening doors. It was interesting. Last night I'm a performer, and I have a weekly show at Charlie's. And someone came up to me after the performance, and this happens to me a lot. And he just randomly started talking to me about EMDR and his EMDR session that day. And he talked about when he was 5 years old and being burned by the nuns. So, and you would hold that image and do the rapid eye movements. But in the Salmona approach, you'd go a lot deeper, and you say, I wonder what they actually did to him. that it's probably something more than just telling him he's going to burn in hell. That's probably the surface level. And then look deeper at that sensation of burning and see what else comes up to get to the bottom of what those nuns actually did to him. You know, did they actually burn him? Because there's probably more abuse going on there than would be recognized by conventional EMDR. So I think even just opening the door to giving people the idea that there's something behind those symptoms would be helpful. Okay. So Salmana's book that I did translate was had a specific focus on sexual violence, because that was what a lot of her people she worked with were victims of, and it is a really extreme one, along with combat and torture, the most extreme one that we can endure. So we mentioned misdiagnosis. I'm sure we're all clear on we don't want society to blame victims. The third one is really relevant. So understanding traumatic memory can directly serve victims in courts, because often their evidence is dismissed when the memories are foggy, blurry, uncertain, or not there. It's taken as a way to discount their memories or their testimony, when actually Salmana advocates for this being strong evidence. So the factors of traumatic amnesia, those being known by courts and being known as evidence, is really important. She's done a lot of work with that in French courts and reforming the justice system to take traumatic amnesia into account. I also just wanted to say thank you, all of you, for the important work that you're doing. And I know that it's not easy work, but it's really, you know, life-changing. So I'm grateful for you for being out there doing that work. Time machine from hell. Yeah. So even when they're in safe situations of safety, the memories stay with people. That's traumatic memory. And Salmana first got interested in this work because she saw survivors of the Holocaust and how they were just expected to get on with life. Like, oh, you know, you're free now. That was bad. Just forget it and get on with life. And really left to their own devices. And she found that very cruel. And then it was found that a lot of them couldn't just get on with their lives and had significant medical as well as psychological problems, which seems to be the norm, normal response to horrific conditions. So I would advocate for traumatic memory being recognized and acknowledged as a hidden disability with more overall social awareness, a recognition of the difficulties in social and professional life that people face, the strategies of survival and how they're neurologically rooted. Like, don't do that. Why are you hurting yourself? That's crazy. You shouldn't do that. When people are cutting themselves, for example, can usually trace that back to something where they were a witness of someone being cut in some way, or that was done to them and they're reliving that. So finding that what actually happened is actually extremely beneficial to their healing. Same with addictions. And they're often mistreated by justice and health systems, either because of bad intentions, and those people might be narcissists and abusers themselves, or because they just don't know. So I was talking about Salmana, so outreach strategies like these brochures that she has that she puts up places. And this is just a quote for one of them. They're really informational and they really help a lot of people, even if they can't access this kind of care, to have some little clues to understanding themselves. Just to answer the question, and the chat, yes, I would say they're in a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. Absolutely. And like I said earlier, the alarm might ring louder at some points and it might ring quieter, but the alarm is never off altogether. So they're always to some degree in that state. In language of trauma. Yeah. Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, how much it seems to miss, typical psychology seems to miss, exactly. Yeah, not understanding the root cause. He's also French. Yeah, there's been a great work by French people. So the brochure, this is just part of it. Maybe you think you're unsuited to life, particularly fragile or born that way. It's not the case. All these symptoms and behaviors can be explained and are usual consequences of violence. It's not you. You're not alone. It's not because of you. They're linked to exceptional neurological survival mechanisms recently identified and usually not identified, let's be honest, usually not acknowledged, put in place by the brain to escape the vital risk that acts of violence create. So we might know about fight, flight, freeze, fawn, but it's less likely to be acknowledged, the chemical dependency on these substances and its role in making us relive trauma and how some people relive it by inflicting it on others. Those pieces of the puzzle are usually not acknowledged. I have some examples from literature here and there because that's part of my background. And it's very telling. The examples from literature, like novelists have always kind of known about this and portrayed it. With each hit, she fades further. She does this by choice. Some deep part of her wants to truly be dead or almost dead. Sounds disappear, blurred images float around her, or more like she floats and doesn't see anything. So classic dissociation, survival mechanism. It's actually helping us to survive. It's the lesser of evils at that time if we can't piece together and heal. So that's important in order to be empathetic with behaviors that seem harmful or irrational as well. It's another reason why that whole get on with life approach doesn't work. The body remembers, that's typically acknowledged. You know, there was The Body Keeps the Score, which I also thought was a great book, but missed a lot of this. Forget to get on with life, the body remembers. And the symptoms in the body can also be used to trace back to the original trauma and reconstruct the narrative. So different roles, same script. So the perpetrator will go and graduate from the role of the victim into the role where they appear to have control and can relive the trauma by inflicting harm. And I remember a few months ago, there was a story about a man who burned down a house to escape sequestration for decades, since his early teens, by his stepmother. And I'm always shocked at how the news covers these as this was a monster, as if it's something inhuman and exceptional, when actually it's something that exactly fits these neurological patterns. And if it can be seen as that, then we can actually prevent these kind of things from happening again. We can actually protect these children, read the signs, protect them, rather than just saying, oh, this was just a monster, an isolated incident. So I just really want there to be more overall awareness in society of what's really going on. And inequality. So we talked about gender, how men are encouraged. Still a very small minority of male victims who will become perpetrators, but there is a gender dimension encouraged by society. But there's also inequalities. You know, perpetrators will choose people they can get away with harming. And so people who are more vulnerable or even people who are racialized, for example, they might be able to get away with inflicting that harm in certain contexts. So they'll take advantage of that. So high-risk activities connected to traumatic memory and should be seen as such, as ways of getting that chemical fix. Often also life can become the most difficult when things are going smoothly because there's not access to that release, that dissociation, those chemicals in the brain. So then people will feel compelled to go out and relive the trauma to get that. I talked about this stuff. Yeah, and this happens that teenagers locked up, women locked up for prostitution without anyone looking at what happened to them to get them there. Poor people, people of color investigated more. I talked about that a little bit. Statistically speaking, sexual abuse happens equally across races, socioeconomic categories, and so on. So this way of targeting poor people and or people of color lets a lot of perpetrators get away, a lot of children be abused, and a lot of people who just need help and are not narcissist perpetrators not getting the help they need. So again, in courts, traumatic amnesia recognition of that something really serious happened if there is traumatic amnesia and seeing the signs of this. So a lot of it is seeing the signs of traumatic memory and being able to use that knowledge in whatever profession you're in, whether it's education or law or anything. Another thing is if jury members are aware of traumatic amnesia and traumatic memory and how it works and dissociation, then they would be less likely to see a victim as cold and detached or doesn't care. The example that comes to mind is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, that novel and movie. The protagonist, Lisbeth Salander, is a classic example of that kind of seeming cold and detached because of your trauma, and then not being able to elicit empathy from people. But if there's more awareness, we can combat that reflex of not having empathy for someone. Okay. Looks like I'm running out of time. So I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. And then I hope that you'll sign up for additional workshops and we can make that happen. Maybe do the writing part, because I'd like to quickly go through the remaining slides, see if there's anything I didn't touch on, and then open for a little question, answer, and discussion. Yeah. I'm reading the chat. Right, I agree. Okay. So there is hope for this. We just all got to work together. Stop minimizing the harm, tell it like it is, demining, getting rid of the landmines that keep people from being able to live and move forward. A narrative reconstruction. Art is very powerful, writing. And then these gaps. I think trauma-informed care is great, but there's a lot of gaps in it. And then just the social justice, recognizing what was wrong and the harm and working together. So these are kind of things that we can do as practitioners. And again, I can send you all of this if you want. These are some kind of practical suggestions for how to do trauma-informed care. Stockholm syndrome is really important. Explaining that to people is really important. Also recognizing the biases that we all have and that society has is super crucial. So, for example, therapists I talk to who are like, well, if we talk about the perpetrator psychology and that their parents were using them to treat their own trauma, we still want to leave the doors open for them to be in touch with their parents, right? That should be their choice. And that sounds 100% good and accurate, unless you think about what choice is based on. Choice is based on having information. So if they don't have access to certain information, then they can't make a choice. So I think a lot of people are pushed into having contact with parents because of the societal idea that, you know, people should be in touch with their families, or the parents always ultimately want what's best for their children, which we all know is not true. But this perpetrator psychology explains why it's not true and why parents would do things to their children. And the Stockholm syndrome explains why children would accept that and adhere to the point of view of their perpetrators and torturers. So that's the normal mechanism, is to survive. I've got to side with them and their values, even if they're almost killing me. And I think it displays a bias when we use words like mother, like, oh, what'd your mama do to you? Because mother implies a caregiver, and if it's a perpetrator, they're not a caregiver. So the benefits are clear and overwhelming. Just the efficacy of finding out who the criminals are, finding out who the victims are, what actually happened, and being able to prevent crimes. Compassionate society. It's convenient to put the fault on the individual and on the victim, and that's what usually happens. But to have compassion, we can view people's behaviors in a context. More opportunities. Think about the opportunities lost of these human resources, of people who are homeless and just struggling to survive, what they could actually do for the world if they were given adequate care. Just to retouch on the key ideas, the worst is not consciously remembered. Stockholm syndrome's the normal response to survival. Our brains force us to relive the trauma that is, unless we recognize what's going on and the full picture and reconstitute things into narratives. Dissociation is another normal survival mechanism. We can heal through finding the whole story. Survivors are very often misdiagnosed. Social justice is a component of healing. So it's important to step back from that neutral stance and actually say, hey, this was wrong. You're supposed to be protected, and this was a crime. There's a hidden epidemic, as we know, of child abuse. And I think one step to combating that is having knowledge of this and accurately detecting the signs of trauma and then investigating them. Inequality is a big factor in trauma. So from Salmona, neurological survival mechanisms put placed by the brain to escape the vital risk that acts of violence create. So that's what traumatic memory is. And then the writing, we won't have time to get to that today, but I'd like to do it with you sometime. I'd like to open for questions and comments. You have 8 minutes.
Hi, I'm Andrea Graber.
Hi,
And
Andrea.
hi. For some reason, I'm having a little trouble getting the hand to raise like I used to be able to. Who knows? But there was something I was remembering from a couple of years ago. PBS put on something. It was a documentary called The Windmere Children, and it was a program in Great Britain for children survivors of the Holocaust, and it was done in this beautiful nature school in northern Great Britain, and used mostly art therapy. And I'm sure it's probably still there to be able to stream on PBS, but it was just one of the most amazing um, documentaries I've seen.
Yeah, that sounds nice.
Wind,
Mm,
Windmere,
yeah,
yeah. Have
great.
you heard of
Yeah.
it?
No.
Has anyone heard of it?
Feel free to put recommendations for stuff in the chat. I just realized we actually have 20 minutes, I believe.
Yeah.
We could actually do this. We could actually do this writing exercise if you would like to. I'll
Here.
briefly go over the writing process and how this can help to reconstruct narrative. And then we can do this. So I'll just go to the essential. So I would recommend that you do this about your own experience. If you start with something unknown, like I don't know why I can't stand the smell of broccoli. I don't know why I can't stand the sound of a washing machine. And or is there a recurring nightmare that I had? Last night I had a nightmare that there was only a curtain. There wasn't a door, there was just a curtain, and this person was coming in that wasn't supposed to be there. And then I woke up and I was like, huh, did I leave a key in my door? Which I had. I went down and checked. So that's just a really basic example. But it could be bigger things. These nightmares teach us something about what happened and give us a clue. An emotional state at a certain time of day. I'd recommend when we do this that you freely associate. You don't need to explain. This is a literary example. You can look at this from Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is the novel that deals with trauma and the trauma of slavery on an individual collective level. So look at how Morrison uses all these spaces. It doesn't necessarily have to make sense. I'm alone, space, 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 space. I want to be the two of us. I want to join. I come out of blue water after the bottoms of my feet swim away from me. This doesn't have to make logical sense. Language of stops. So this is from my own writing, which you can read. So this is kind of the opposite, has a lot of periods rather than running all together. Yeah, like period A, period shirt, period full of holes that cannot warm or be worn. So different techniques enable us to express different states. So we don't pay attention to grammar. It can be the senses, can be a smell, taste, touch, what you're going through. So pick a word, pick a nightmare, pick a feeling, a word. Not required to access the memory, but it might be some door to open. So we'll take, let's see, maybe take a few minutes to do this writing exercise, and then we can share them. If people want to, we can even share them in smaller groups. So let's see, it's 42. We can go to 1247. So just take a break and do this writing. So you're going to free write about a nightmare, phobia, flashback, sensation of any kind that you don't understand about yourself. And just, I recommend just like keeping your pen or keyboard moving and not censor it. So let's do that. We'll come back in 5 minutes. Okay, thank you for doing that. I saw a lot of you look like you're writing, so I was glad to see that. Um, so I would like to put you in breakout rooms. You might be with 2 people or 3 people, and you can share what you did if you would like to. I recommend when you share just reading things, but you can do it any way you want. I always like the ones that don't have a lot of explanation. Um, but we'll do that. Let's see. We'll do that for 5 minutes as well. Then you can get a chance to talk to someone. Um, and then we'll come back. So here we go.
Hi, Kate. I accidentally got kicked. Could I go back to my group?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to do that. What was your group? Do you remember what number or who you were with?
Group one. I was with
Okay.
yeah,
Okay,
Christy
good. I
and Megan.
think I
Yeah.
can assign you to that. Here we go.
Thank
Okay,
you.
sure. All right. So I just put the link in the chat for Salmona's book that I translated. So you should be able to get it that way. And just a brief conclusion, some of the main points. Justice-informed care complements trauma-informed care, the social justice focus. Narrative reconstruction helps survivors to heal by seeing the whole picture. And perpetrator psychology is a really important element of that. This should not be neglected to understanding the whole picture. And it's a really standard pattern. Writing can be used for the narrative reconstruction. So now we just got 5 minutes, and I'd like to again open it for anything you'd like to share with the group and or questions. And I'll put my email here in the chat too. So please do email me. I would love to hear from any of you with any further questions, comments, anything. You can also volunteer with my organization. It's an official 501c3 now. I can use lots of help and anything, so keep in touch. Thank you. Thanks, I really appreciate this opportunity to present it to those of you who can do the most with it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kate. Really appreciate your time and all the information, and perhaps we'll have some more opportunities to interact with you as NAPS in the future. So really appreciate it.
That would be wonderful. Thank you. I look forward to staying in touch,
Yeah.
developing this together. All right, I'll stay on another couple minutes, but if you want to leave, go ahead, and thank you so much. And if you have anything else you'd like to say, I'll be here for 4 more minutes.
This was really, really, really valuable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. Appreciate that. Thanks.
Kate, I just wanted to thank you for using the breakout, because I actually don't think I've done that before in a,
Yeah.
in a Zoom, and it's really special for me to communicate with one, or it could have been a couple of people instead of a whole group.
Right. Yeah.
And I couldn't find how to send it to Catherine, but thank you, Catherine. That was special to do that with you.
Great.
And how do you find to send to an individual? Because usually I think it's on there with a initial, but I don't see it on the chat.
To send messages to individuals in chat?
Yeah. I see
Yeah.
where to send it to everyone, but I don't, but unless the person already is up there, I couldn't find it. Anyway, but that's not as
I'm
important.
looking. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on that.
Okay, then let's not talk. Oh, I see her now. I see her now. So I guess maybe everybody's up there and there are not that many of them right now.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, that's all. Let me let someone else
you.
talk.
Yeah. Thanks.